Hello, welcome. My name is Larry Arnn. We're here in the Richardson Heritage Room of the Mossy Library of Hillsdale College. We're talking about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, their meaning and their relationships. This fourth in the series is about the distinction between two kinds of rule that are present in America today. One is centralized administrative or bureaucratic rule, and one is constitutional rule after the old model. I think there's a choice to be made between them, and that's coming soon, I believe, so this understanding is important. This will be followed by a fifth and final broadcast in which you will get a chance to ask any questions you want to, and I will do my best to answer them, probably with some other people helping me. And please watch this, and thank you for your attention. Thank you for watching these lectures. To conclude them, I'm going to try to draw a contrast between two ways of governing. I think this contrast is the choice we have to make. We have to decide if we're going to be governed one way or the other. I don't think they're compatible. I don't think that this particular house can remain divided against itself indefinitely. And I'm not going to be able to do this contrast completely, but I can indicate it to you, and you can read more. We talk about things like this here all the time at Hillsdale College, and you can come around here and learn more if you want to. The contrast is between centralized administrative bureaucratic rule, that's what we have a lot of today, and constitutional rule, and those depend on different principles and they have different ways of proceeding, and I think they can be distinguished. I think you can tell the difference between the works of one versus the works of the other. And also, if you could get the distinction in your mind, you could see that a lot of things that we do today bureaucratically were done in the past by other means, by constitutional means, not bureaucratically. And that is a lesson. Not everything that we do today was done in the past. And then in those cases, we have to figure out, should we be doing them or not? And if we were doing them, should we do them by bureaucratic means or by constitutional means? What do I mean by bureaucratic? In the first lecture, I mentioned that word history. And it came to be thought, in the 19th century especially, that the great story of human life, of all being, really, is a story of time and circumstance altering everything. And that means that we are in a process of history that changes everything. Human societies alter all the time. And that means that the principles in one society, at one time in a society, won't really apply later, unless there's just this one principle that's kind of a contradiction, but never mind that. We're not going to try to exploit that contradiction today. That, of course, what is the status of the principle that everything changes? Does that principle change? There's a contradiction there, but forget it for a moment. Here's what was noticed. They say that there's these laws of nature and nature's God, but they hadn't prevailed at other times. And, you know, in England, they had their king, and they were happy with him, they thought, or at least a lot of people were. And so when they announced that this is a universal principle, they're really only saying something about their own time. And we recognize that means that we, now, are really only saying something about our time. But we have the same right to say that as they had in the founding. We shouldn't be governed by something so old-fashioned as these guys with these powdered wigs, when the society has become much more complex than it was back then, and we need entirely new ways to govern. There's a kind of a despair in this, it's worth pointing out, because it means that you're not really claiming that you have an authority for what you do that's ultimate in any sense. You're really only reacting to the circumstances right around you. And the gloomiest example that I know of that I like to mention, there was a guy, he was a famous American progressive, one of the most important ones. His name was Frank Goodnow. He was a professor at Columbia. He was president of Johns Hopkins University. He was one of the founders of the American Political Science Association. He was its first president. And Goodnow writes in a place, I'll paraphrase it, it's in our Constitution reader, he writes that we teachers take ourselves too seriously sometimes. Because really what's going to happen is what they think is going to end up being determined by the economic conditions in which they live. Now think what that means for a minute, right? Because here's the relationship in a college between young people and the college. The young people are part of the college. The college is just, the word just means partnership. What is the situation of the young people? There's some in this room, right? And their situation is they got no idea what's going to happen to them. They don't really even know what they're going to do for a living in their lives or who they're going to marry or anything. And so a great thing to study is something that is of abiding worth. They're really interested in that. They love that kind of thing. They want to know what are the laws of nature and nature's God, because if I could know those, I could have some predictability in my life. I could understand how things are going to unfold and how I should react to them. I could have a star to guide me by. Goodenow says there isn't such a thing. We teachers shouldn't take ourselves too seriously. Isn't that a sad thing? I think so. I grieve for the man. I don't know that it bothered him too much. The way he puts the point is kind of sobering, yeah, I have to admit. What we say, it's not going to determine what they think. And it's a curious position he places himself in because, by the way, what determines what he thinks? Except economic circumstances, right? What's the standing of anything he says, right? That's a despair point. And a lot of the progressives have some resentment against the founders because they put up this pretense of these grand ideas. Who are they to do that? That's in the way now. Get rid of that. That's kind of imperial. That's kind of bossy. We're not going to be like that, except for this. We have a new tool. Modern science, the method of trial and error, that could be applied to human society. It's a kind of science that has revealed to us this great fact that everything changes. But now we could take that tool and we could apply it to administration. We could appoint a scientific class, and they could be in charge of innovative new policies to make the world right. Now go back and think about that word right. What does it mean to make the world right if there's no standard of right except the circumstances in which you're in right now? What does that mean? But never mind. We could control the circumstances. And so we have to organize a government. You should read the writing of some of the teachers here and others. R.J. Pastrito has written well on this, and John Marini, who teaches in Nevada. And some of their writing is available in our Constitution. No, actually, it's the original store stuff, although R.J. writes an introduction to one of the sections. They want to build a kind of administration that doesn't have separation of powers in it. And they have built that. That means there's a funny thing in our Constitution reader, it's published in the Harvard Law Review, about a fellow describing how the Federal Trade Commission works. And it's funny the way it reads because he says things like, if the commission decides to investigate a matter, it sends members of the commission to find out the facts. And then they bring the facts back to the commission, and the commission deliberates about whether to lodge a complaint or levy a fine. And then if they do levy the fine, then the person will probably want to appeal, and he will appeal to the commission. The commission will decide whether the appeal is to be heard. And if the commission decides to sustain the appeal, then he can at last finally go to the courts, but the courts can't really override any finding of fact that the commission has made. So the commission is the legislative, executive, and judicial branch all rolled into one. And the commission can be trusted to do that because these are scientifically trained people, and they will have tenure. They can't be fired. And so they won't really have any interest that conflicts with the public interest. They can be trusted with this power. And because they are scientific people and they know, they should write rules. And the rules should be made at the center. Now, I am the president of Hillsdale College, and at Hillsdale College, best as I can count, we have about 150 pages, a little bit less probably, of rules that govern our students and our faculty and our staff. We have a faculty handbook, and we have an honor code and a student handbook, and we have a staff code of conduct, and they're all very compatible documents. In fact, they're all written out of the original 1844 document. And if they're still as long as 150 pages, that's too long, and we'll probably have another effort. We've had several to cut back the amount of rules, because if you don't govern people by rules, if instead you agree goals and purposes with them, and then you have a kind of broad idea about, well, how we're going to act, we're going to tell the truth and cooperate with each other and be civil and stuff like that, save money and stick to the budget, all that stuff, then people can own their jobs. That's a kind of constitutional kind of rule. You see that kind of rule supported in a college all the time, because if you teach, what you learn is most of the work is done by the students. You need to be good. You need to be available to them above all. You need to love what you do. You need to know something about it. But whatever you're doing with them, they're really doing it for the first time. They've got to dig in. And everybody doing a job is in the same position, right? It's their job. You can't do it for them. There are about 400 people who work here at this college. That means on a given day, I do about 1/400th of the work. And, you know, some days I'm not very good. Some days I'm pretty good. The rest of them are good. They do their jobs. The Department of Education for Title IV, that's the part that does student aid, we don't take that money. The compliance documents, the last time I counted, were almost 500 pages long. And they're very detailed, and they were written by people who don't work in colleges. And I was told by an attorney who represents our college one time that they were too complex for me to read. I got my dudgeon up a little bit and said, really? You know, I've read some pretty complicated stuff in my life. And he said, yeah, I can't read it either. We keep a specialist here to read it. And you know, some of the big bills they passed recently are more than 2,000 pages long. But that's nothing, because they're busy doing the rulemaking on those bills now. And the rulemaking will be thousands of pages long, many thousands, and very complex. And one part refers to another, and so to get a handle on it, you've really got to make a specialization of it, and that means you've got to hire somebody who does that. And the method of proceeding is rules made at the center. And you know, in early American history, there was almost none of that. My favorite two laws that have ever been passed by any legislative body that I can think of are the Northwest Ordinance and the Homestead Act. The Northwest Ordinance gave the largest subsidy to education we've ever given. What it did was provide for, in the Northwest Territory, that's 5 states, including Michigan, that belonged to the Union at the time of the American Revolution, but then wasn't yet organized as states. It provided a way so that they could be organized as states, never to be colonies, always to be treated as equal souls. And they also provided a way to dispose of the land, because the land all belonged to the government. This land we're standing on right now at Hillsdale College used to belong to the government. And what they did was they sold it into private hands as rapidly as they could. Except for one exception, there was one exception, and that is the 16th section of each township. A township is a mile on a side, and there are 36 sections. So 1/36th of a square mile was reserved as an endowment given to the states to support education in each township, in that township. Massive subsidy of education. And the Northwest Ordinance, which, you know, for years when we used to count our things like this, we should do it again, was one of the 4 organic laws of the United States. The Northwest Ordinance is about 3,000 words long. And it states a purpose of education. Like a lot of the early American documents, it tends to have grand and inspiring purposes, like the laws of nature and nature's God, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, like rights. And those are beautiful and simple, and that means everybody can know what they are. Madison writes in the Federalist Papers once, if the laws are voluminous and complicated so you can't read them, then they're not really properly laws, even if they're made by the legislature and signed by the president, because We all need to be able to know what the law is because we are agents of the law in a constitutional system. We are the source of the law, and we are important in carrying out the law, each individual one of us. So government, they thought, should be simple. And the Northwest Ordinance is simple. And it says about the purposes of education. Why is there going to be this one reservation for a public use of land out of the whole 5-state Northwest Territory? Why? And the answer is because religion, morality, and knowledge is necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Isn't that handsome? Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall ever be encouraged. That's a law made pursuant to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. It was actually passed in the same summer that the Constitution of the United States was being written, so it was passed under the Articles of Confederation, but it is very much the kind of law that would prevail. Another example, my other favorite law that was ever passed, is the Homestead Act. It was signed by Abraham Lincoln in 1862. It's about 1,300 words long. And what it did was give away 10% of the land area of the United States as it then existed to any family, unnamed who it would be. If they would agree to live on the land for 5 years, they could have, I think, 160 acres. That's a remarkable thing. Isn't that generous, by the way? Anybody could have it. At the time, you know, feudalism still prevailed in parts of Europe, and that means that in those countries where that still prevailed, you could never really own any land of your own. Only rich people, only nobles and lords, only the Tsar in Russia could own any land. And here, anybody can have some land. You can just go get it, right? It's for you. And it's 1,300 words long. And there's no bureaucracy founded by it at all. It's a very interesting thing. Now, they did have land offices and stuff like that, but they already existed. And the point was, there was an effort to make the government simple, and now there's a specific effort to make the government complex. Because it said the society is more complex. And I don't really see that myself, and I'll tell you why. If you imagine George Washington with his army in 1777, say, pick a year. Pick any year in the American Revolution, and most of it was bad for him. Imagine him, and what's he think he's doing, right? He's never run a big army before. There's never been a country like this before. They're making war on the most powerful government on earth. They don't know how. There's nobody really with any experience to fight these British guys who know how to run an army, and a lot of them are very talented people. They got wealth, they got establishment, they're old, they're set. No country had ever been founded in the name of these principles before. They name, I mentioned it before, they name the army the Continental Army, but they don't know how big the continent is. They're not going to know until 1806, by which time George Washington is dead, Thomas Jefferson is president of the new republic, and he sent Lewis and Clark out there, all the way across, and by some miracle, they made it all the way across and then all the way back, and they gave him a report. Nobody knew before then at all. And it was another 50 years, really, before the, because 1844, I think California came into the Union, 1849. And that means that the continent is far in the future. And no country had ever been settled according to these principles before. And by the way, most of the people who are going to settle the country are not even here yet. They don't even know what country they're going to come from. That's complex and also unprecedented. And they thought maybe that was going to work, right? I don't think these circumstances are more complex than those. I think that the grand simplicities are there, and if they were ever true, they're true now. And if they're not true now, they weren't true then. Because that's the kind of claim that they make. What they say is that if they're true, they are abiding, and they'll always be true. And by the way, whatever in the past did not fully recognize the truth of this was an error. That's what they say. That's complicated, also simple. And the point is, if that's our choice, I'll mention some of the things that follow on the choice. Because here's a picture of America in 1830. Now, mind you, we've talked some about slavery here. America is a place where there's been a great deal of injustice. You know why? It's a human thing. The Indian tribes have suffered terribly because of us. One of our professors here writes on that stuff, and he tells me about it. And he thinks we should have done it differently. And that there would have been a way. He thinks he knows what the way was. But it was a great tragedy, right? Those things happened. But are there no tragedies today? Things go wrong today? What is the status of the family in the inner city or in the law today? What's going to be the effect of all that? It's a problem, I think. Looks like one. What's going on in Europe right now? There are problems. I read that one cannot go into the cities, in the central cities of many European great cities, London, for example, or any of the county towns or provincial towns, at night on a Friday or Saturday night because the young people are dangerous. Ordinary young people. There are problems, right? There were problems then. There are problems now. And here's something you get for this. This produces something. Something remarkable. Tocqueville writes in, Alexis de Tocqueville is a Frenchman who came to America in the 1830s, and very perceptive guy, wrote an important book called Democracy in America. It's a picture of America at the time. I have quarrels with it myself, but anybody who reads it has got to think it's wonderfully insightful. And he makes this contrast, and it's really a contrast between constitutional rule according to these principles and these arrangements and other kinds of rule. He notices, he says, and remember, he'd never been here before, never seen anything like this. The European generally submits to a public officer because he represents a superior force. In other words, you obey the law because it has power, which is natural. But to an American, he represents a right. That is to say, when you see a public official, you think he works for you. In America, it may be said that no one renders obedience to man but to justice and to law. If the opinion which the citizen entertains of himself is exaggerated, it is at least salutary. He unhesitatingly confides in his own powers, which appear to him to be all-sufficient. Now, that's a little bit derisory, right? We think more of ourselves than we should. I don't know what's the better alternative. I think it would be best of all if we could think of ourselves as we should. But would you rather have a citizen body that thinks less of itself or more of itself? And this gives rise to something, this thinking that we're in charge, according to Tocqueville. When a private individual meditates an undertaking, however directly connected it may be to the welfare of society, he never thinks of soliciting the cooperation of the government, but he publishes his plan, offers to execute himself, courts the assistance of other individuals, and struggles manfully against all obstacles. By the way, you know how this college comes to be here? It was up the road in Spring Arbor, Michigan, up near Jackson, Michigan on the freeway. And it was founded in 1844. We moved here in 1852, 53. And we moved here to get to a big town. Hillsdale was on the rail, still on the railway. And that was the thing that mattered back then. Hillsdale now has 10 or 12,000 people in it. Big town, major city. And when we did it, 3 or 4 guys working for the college got on their horses and went around in the winter to various towns talking to them about starting a college, about moving the college to their town. The guy who came to Hillsdale was a guy named Dunn, who worked here for 50 years, Ransom Dunn, galvanizing man. And he went to the hotels, I think there were 2 at the time, and he went to the people and he said to the hotelier, he said, "Could you gather the leading citizens for me who are interested in education?" And they showed up in City Hall. Now they used City Hall But nobody thought that the government should build a college. And they said, we'll make a deal with you. You give us, Ransom Dunn said this, he said, this is going to be an abolitionist college. We don't like slavery. This is going to be a freedom college. We like the American Constitution and the principles of the Declaration. And this is this is going to be a Christian college. We like the Christian faith here. If you want that kind of college, we'll move it here. We need you to give us $10,000. And that's a lot of money back then. And the city fathers of Hillsdale, we ended up coming here because they were shrewd cusses, and they said, they went away and deliberated and thought, and they said, okay, we'll give you $15,000, but you have to match it. And Dunn got off on his horse and went off and did that. Took him 2 years. He rode all over Wisconsin. He'd preach on a Sunday, and he'd get people who came to the service to give $5, $3, $2. We still have a list of the names, the first donors to Hillsdale College, here at the college. It's a really cool story, really great story. And the story is consequential for our union. Because, you know, we had 500 young men go fight for the Union Army in the Civil War. And nobody made them do that. We didn't even have any military training here then. We don't really have it here now either. Still have a lot of kids go in the military. Why'd they go? They went because they came to love something. They came to love that right there. They saw that it offered an opportunity to people unnamed and unknown to anybody. They saw that it's called with that beckoning. They saw that it was a system that required limited, you know, there's no bunch of abolitionists more firm than the people who started this college, but these people also invented the notion, with others, but they were among the first inventors of it, that the Constitution is precious too, and because it's imperfect and it doesn't let us abolish slavery in the states where it exists, we should not do that. We should rather only do it by constitutional means, because the argument goes that if these principles are true, they are describing a being of such a kind that he may not be governed except with his consent, but also being of such a kind, he must be governed in these ways because we are the kind of creature that will take advantage of each other if we get a chance, either the many or the few of us. And so you see, the point is, back here, started by a bunch of people who didn't have any money to speak of. They started this college, and it was private, and it didn't cost anybody any money that didn't want to give it, and a lot of people did. And the next thing you know, there's a battlefield in Pennsylvania that in July, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863, the course of the world changed. Because who won the Battle of Gettysburg turned out to matter a lot. And we had a lot of young men there. A lot of them died there. Why'd they go? Because of things they learned here. But the things were not taught them with the idea that that's what would happen. They were taught them because those things seemed lovely and true. And they were taught in an academic setting where they were argued over, because of course there were fierce debates back then, just as there are now. And the product of those things is that kind of governance. And the product of the other thing is a governance that's more expert and more centralized. And I think it a fair statement to say that to violate this principle, or this one, which modern bureaucratic government does violate all three of them. James Madison writes that the reason for this is that men are not angels and angels do not govern men. That's the case for the constitutional form. And so I would argue that the American people should spend a lot of time thinking about these distinctions in the coming months and years, because they have a choice to make. Thank you.